So the topic for this workshop is called statement vases. And to me, they're large vases, but they're large vases with soft slabs. But before we get to that, I came across this quote today that I could relate to by Joseph Pintz. And he said, and I quote, "I embrace irregularities as a part of the character of my work. They're not covered up, but become an integral part of the whole." And it just spoke to me. It's a quote that I'm going to keep. I think that we need to keep in mind that we have a voice in what we make, but the clay does too. And sometimes those irregularities, as he put that, are what give the piece its personality and not make it so sterile. So it's just something to keep in mind. So about the vases, so I will be working with slabs that are 14 by 16 inches. If you don't work in that size, you could certainly work smaller or larger. That's just the size that I'm working with. And things to keep in mind when you're working larger than you would normally work is about how you handle the clay. Handle it with great care, handle it as little as possible, and think about the kind of clay that you're using. If you're starting to work larger than is your normal practice, it's a good idea to work with a clay that you're familiar with, that you feel comfortable with as a whole. And maybe you could incrementally go larger, but regardless, don't start with a new clay. And I would say work with a clay that has sand or grog in it, not a porcelain, at least initially, because that sand or grog gives your piece a little bit of structural integrity and stability and is not so floppy as porcelain can be. And then also, don't work with your clay fresh out of the bag if you can help it. Roll it out. I roll it out a couple of days ahead and dry it between layers of newspaper wrapped up in plastic. Some people like to use old fabric. You don't want your clay to be so soft because it's going to be harder to deal with. And that's about it. Those are things to keep in mind, and practice, practice, practice. And speaking of recording, you probably are aware of this, but let me make it clear that you have 30 days to watch this recording. So you can go back over it if you're not working along with, or even if you are, and kind of pick up anything that you feel like, wait a minute, what was that? That's one of the advantages of this virtual workshop thing. So
could you try holding that close? There's light. I'm going to zoom in so we can see the texture because the lighting is blowing out the.
Yeah, it's very, the finish on this, of course, being that it was wood fired, is very different from the other two colorful ones that I showed you that I fired in the electric kiln. And so I specifically wanted folks to be able to see this because it has such a different personality coming out of the wood kiln. This was from a workshop at the Mendocino Art Center, January of last year. And I am lucky enough to be able to do another wood firing then this coming August. I think one of the first in-person things they're going to have. So, and this was done with a high fire B mix because the wood kiln fires a lot higher than I would fire in my studio. All right, so let me pull out some clay here, you guys, which I have rolled out at my studio. Have it off to the side, so bear with me a moment, folks. So first I'm going to show you a joining method, if you will. If you don't have access to a slab roller, it doesn't mean you can't have larger slabs. So I'm going to compress this because it's got some irregularities. I love this yellow mud tool rib for this purpose, and I just wet it a little bit, and when I'm doing any compressing or combining, you want to go in different directions to really secure it. but I'm going to cut it apart so I then can join it and show you what I mean. So suppose you had two separate slabs and you couldn't roll out a bigger one. So a good way to join it then is to cut on a bevel. So I'm cutting in here on a bevel, and then I'm going to overlap it. And when I do the overlap, anytime I'm joining and do an overlap, I want the other slab to sit over the top so that flap, if you will, goes across the whole thing. If you feel like your slab at this point, if you're doing any joining, is too dry, you could easily do scoring, but this is not necessary, so you probably noticed I just wet it down. And I'll take my pony roller and roll it. But now again, I don't want this to think it's two separate pieces of clay anymore. And with all the maneuvering and things that are going to go on, that could happen. So then you would go back and compress. And when I'm compressing, I am not holding this vertical to the clay. It's on an angle because I don't want to dig in. And I'm kind of doing an X motion because I want these two pieces to no longer think of themselves as two pieces. I want them to think of themselves and act in a way as if they're one piece of clay. All right, and I realize what I made here isn't a very big slab, but I'm just demonstrating the technique to you guys. Okay. So I have my great big slab here, and it was rolled out in my slab roller several days ago and wrapped up and set up between sheets of newspaper and then covered up with plastic.
Lynn, did you bevel one piece and not the other?
Correct. That's a very good question. I did bevel one piece and not the other. I have found that if I bevel the two of them and put them together, and then I do that compression and rolling, then my seam is too thin. So I found that if I only bevel one, I have enough excess clay when I do all that compression to get the thickness more or less even. Thank you for asking that question. So if this clay was fresh out of the bag and I picked it up like this, I would get drooping. It wouldn't have any of its own structural integrity. And especially working larger, that becomes even more important. So there's no fancy template for today. I just have this file folder that I cut to 14 by 16. So I need to roll my clay out a little bit in that direction before I think about whatever texture I'm going to put on it. Because being the pottery texture queen, of course, there's going to be texture. And I had said a while ago, for those of you that have been with me any other times, that I had some new patterns coming out. And they're still in the works. They're not quite done yet. I usually have new patterns before the NCECA conference, and I will before the NCECA conference next March. But I found by not having a deadline, I wasn't pushing myself hard enough to get them done. But I'm on it now, so there'll be 3 new patterns coming soon. If you want to check any of those out, they're on my website, potterytexturequeen.com. I'm just getting rid of some air bubbles here, folks. And my students, virtual and in person, get 20% discount. So for that, you would need to send an email to me, not go to my Etsy site because I don't give the discount on Etsy. So if you have any interest in that, look at potterytexturequeen.com and then send me an email at potterytexturequeen@yahoo.com. All right, that's pretty good. And if it's not exactly the size, it'll all be good. So then I have to think about what kind of patterning I want to do on this. And I use all kinds of bisque stamps I have a leather stitch marking tool, which you'll see in a moment when I pull that green vase out again. And as far as this goes, you can buy these online. And sometimes people ask about using a stitching tool like you would for a sewing situation. But those tend to have much longer points and they can cut into the clay. So if you have one laying around or you find one at the used secondhand store, I would say file it down with sandpaper. But recently, I got turned on to the idea of using a fondant tool, and I bought this set of 3 very inexpensively online. They're slightly different than this old metal one that I have, but they're plastic, so they're just not as harsh on the clay. So I use those. I use my mats. I use a lot of bisque stamps that I've made. I use a lot of things from nature too. But the main point I wanted to get to here is if I'm using my mats and I'm doing something as large as I'm going to do with you guys today, it's not going to cover the whole thing. So you learn to work with the tools that you have. Plus, I like not to cover the whole surface because I think design-wise, it's more interesting if you have some blank or quiet areas, you might say. So here's that green one again. And I've used 2 different mats, but then I also left some areas where I used some stamps and left some other areas. And the stitch marking tool, which was this one that I used here, to me kind of ties the design together. So I'm going to do something like that for this first one that I'm going to show you guys today. But like that, but not the same. So I think I will use 2 mats. I think I'll use this one, the Whimsy mat, and then probably this one, which is called my Nouveau mat. And I have cut that apart because I have people often asking about making bigger mats, and I can't do that at a good price point. But if you had this mat and you cut it apart, you could put other things in between and still have the design speak as a whole. Okay, so I'm going to use part of that one and this one. Now, the first thing that I'm going to do here, before I even put the texture on, is mark down this left-hand edge to indicate where my left part of my seam is going to be. And I'm left-handed, so I am doing that so I know not to put any texture right here at the moment. I can add it later. But when I go to join this, if I have texture in here, it's going to get all smeared out when I go over the seam. So I leave a little bit of area there blank. If you're right-handed, you probably want to do that on the right-hand side. All right, then I'm going to get started. And your mats can be on top or underneath. In this case, with this application, because of what I'm doing, it makes more sense for them to be on top. And the first thing I'm going to do is press hard in the middle here to get this so that it doesn't move around, and then I have to go for it. You know, and you could make this without any texture. You could use all kinds of different things. I'm just showing you what I do. So if you don't know about the NCCA conference, that's the National Conference of the Ceramic Arts that generally happens in March, around the 3rd weekend of March, in a different city every year. And of course, it hasn't happened in person the last 2 years. And we here in California, Northern California specifically, are very, very lucky that next year it's going to be in Sacramento, California, which is about an hour from here. It's not far at all. It's the capital of California. And if you have never been, I really want to encourage you to think about it. It's 3 full days plus kind of another half day. and might not sound like a long amount of time, but it's jam-packed with exhibits, demonstrations. I'll be in the commercial area that they call the resource hall with my products. Lots of great things going on. You get fully immersed. It's a wonderful, wonderful event. So, while I was doing all that blabbing, you might have noticed I pressed pretty hard. I've noticed with people that haven't been experienced with these, that they might not press as hard as is necessary at first. And so the thing to do after you press is, before you peel it all off, is kind of double check. And this worked out fine. And then I'm gonna place it this way, and see, also my clay doesn't stick to it. The only time your clay would stick to these if your clay is really gushy, fresh out of the bag. And then you can always use a little cornstarch. Okay, get this guy placed. So what I do is I place the bigger parts of my texture right away before I do my final cutting. And I always start with my clay a little bigger than I'm gonna need it for my piece, because when you put the texture on it, the edges get thinned down. So I wanna be able to cut away that thinner edge. Let's see how I did here. Okay, looks pretty good. Okay, let me move these out of the way. Pick this up. By the way, I work on this surface that's called a printer blanket. It's rubber on what I call the back side, and a very fine canvas on the front side. Lithography printers use these. And if you have a lithography printer in your area, they might be willing to part with them. There aren't as many lithography printing places these days, because so much is done digitally. But you can also find them online, new, for sale. And they're a great surface. You can also put them through your slab roller. So I highly recommend them as a great work surface. And if you work in some dark clay and light clay, you can have a couple of sets. It's pretty great. All right, I know that I don't want this whole thing. I just want this kind of linear part. So I have this piece from a cereal box that I'm going to use as a block to make sure I don't get that on my clay. So get that set in there. If you are a hand builder, or you're getting more into hand building and you don't have one of these pony rollers, you definitely want one of these. They're a great tool. And I don't know if you've noticed, but I'm using the smaller end. A lot of times people will pick up the bigger end. I don't know, bigger is not always better. Here it has this nice curve, and there's something about having this small part of the roller that gives you more directed pressure that I find very effective. All right, let's see here how that worked out. Okay. And then I'm going to copy it over here, but I don't need this to block any area off anymore.
Could you slide the texture that you just did downwards so you can see it mix up?
Oh, this?
Yeah.
You bet.
Perfect.
You got it. So I'll put one more here. So now I have the main parts of my texture kind of laid out here on this slab. This edge is a little drier. So the next part that I do is I take my template and I lay it out on my slab with a little bit of thinking about where I want things to fall. And then I'm going to cut out the basic shape. I have to make it a little smaller, that's okay. So like when I joined those two smaller slabs together to demonstrate that technique earlier, I'm going to bevel in at my left-hand edge. If you are right-handed, it probably makes more sense to bevel in my right-hand edge, because as you're right-handed, this is just awkward. But I bevel in at this side, holding my template down. And I'll cut across what will be the top here. This excess out of the way. Then I'm looking to see where my right edge can be. And after I take this file folder off of here, I could decide I might want to trim it more where I see where the design totally falls. But it might be okay, we'll see. So I'm pulling this up so that I'll have a good edge at the base. So again, you want to work with a clay that you're comfortable with, that you've worked with before, that you and the clay kind of know each other and get along okay. All right, this looks pretty good for a start. But these are all separate little quadrants, and I want them to relate to each other. So just because I talked about this new tool, I'm going to use this to mark, and again, hopefully join some of my designs. And no matter what kind of a stitching kind of a tool you might use, you want to make sure not to dig in too much. And I probably will be adding some sprigs onto here later. So this is still not going to be completely done design-wise until it's all constructed, but get it together. All right, so that is starting to relate. Then I have this little bisque stamp, that's my chop with my initials, and I sometimes put it on the bottom of pieces, but often I put it right on the piece itself. One potter friend of mine says I hijack it into my work, so I'll put that little accent there. And I need to do a little something here. I'm not sure what, so I'm gonna get a little scrap of clay here to play with.
And how thick is the slab you're working on here?
So it started out 3/8 of an inch. I actually have a ruler. So now it's about 1/4 of an inch. And I wouldn't go any thinner than that, because it gets all clay, no matter what clay, is going to get a lot floppier if it's much thinner than that. Sometimes people think thinner is better, and that's not always true. In this instance, it wouldn't be. All right, I'm thinking about what I might want to have happen in here. And I already don't like what happened here, so I know I want to put a stamp there.
You might have to zoom out because I'm not getting the whole slab.
Zoom out. Okay, Kayla's gonna help with the camera so we can see the whole thing. She's gonna adjust things to make it better. But meantime, let me get some of these little toys out. And this, I taught this workshop a couple of times, a couple of varieties of this virtually over this past 14 months with Sonoma. And the making of the bisque stamps is one of the 2 workshops that we have currently up for you to get a recording later on. There's this one and one of my teapot ones. So if you're interested in learning all the techniques I have for this, it is up on the website under recorded. Yes, absolutely. So what I will do here is I'll test a whole bunch of them out on this board so people can see. So I love spirals. In fact, this spiral mat was one of the original mats that I started with when I started this mat business in 2008. So I have a lot of different spiral types. So this is one I carved. Here is one with a coil attached on, so a much more organic kind of spiral. And I can hold this all up in a moment. I can hold each one up. So again, on the recording, it shows you all the different ways that I carve or create these. I don't want to waste too much of your time. I love nature as a theme, so I have a lot of leaves lately. In fact, this little stamp, which is on that green vase, this one became a favorite of mine. And you know how it is. You have 100 tools, and then one thing's your favorite, and I lost it. So I made 3 or 4 spares, and then I found it. But I have this marked with this Sharpie marker because it gets lost in the pile of things. There's just a little X. Slightly different spiral from the first one that I showed you. This is a bone from a lamb chop. I like to use that with this. So this little stamp is the handle from one of these foam brushes. When the brush part died, I took my Dremel tool and drilled in at this end and at this end, and I'll show you what those do. So I love to use that round one inside my lamb chop. Crazy things that we fall in love with. And I also use the Dremel here, so that makes a slightly different variation. Do I need to move this? Kayla's trying to help me get this aimed properly. Okay, there we go. So this is a bigger spiral. This one, I'm not sure if this is one that broke. It might have, but I carved pretty deeply in this one. So that's a linear kind of a pattern. I have a bunch of these little rollers. And I learned this technique from Amy Sanders. Her website is called There Pottery. She makes lots of these kind of rollers. So these are great for borders. And when I do these fatter coils, I also do things at either end. I'm gonna flip this over to the other side. So again, this could be a border or you could repeat it. But then because I carved in the end, it does something a little bit different there. It's just not straight ahead. There's that. And then the other end is slightly different. I need to get another slab here. And trust me, you guys, this is a very small portion of the stamps that I have. Just like the last workshop I taught before this one was the template making workshop. And somebody asked, how do you organize your templates? And I said, well, it's an ongoing challenge I have. Vase ones over here, other ones over here, small bits like the spouts over there. I have so many. If you only have 5 or 6, that's fine. And I'm always going back over them and culling them, but organizing them is a challenge. So my favorite of these stamps I have at the ready, and then I have others sort of more in the background. So this one has kind of irregular lines, and again, I also carved on the ends. Like I said, this is a small selection of all that I use. So I'll be stamping directly onto this bigger slab that's going to become the vase. And then I'll be doing some sprigs as well. So, by the way, when I chose these two patterns, I specifically chose ones that were in contrast. So here we have this kind of circular design and then a linear design, because that contrast helps draw your eye to the design. It's a very good design principle, having contrast. And so I do that with my stamps as well as color. All right, so love that one. I might use these two. I'm not sure if I'm going to use more. So I'm going to stamp over that spot that I was not happy with. Maybe one or two of these leaves.
The whole slab to see how you're creating composition to fill the space.
Yeah.
Based off the grid.
Yeah, it has a grid. I don't try and line everything up. You know, I specifically don't divide my space in half. I think when you divide things in half, it can be kind of dead. And also, if you are going to divide it in half, you have to get it just right, or it looks like you messed up. And I like more variety to draw your eye to look at different parts of the composition. So I'll leave these two bigger ones out because I may use them again. And that one's speaking to me, so. Play is a part of the game, and the journey and the experience, of course, are another part of it. All right, I'm checking this to see if it's still flexible. Seems so. Get this out of our way. Oh, we got a little issue that's going to come up here, Kayla. We have the microphone on the banding wheel. I think there's another banding wheel over there if you want it on a banding wheel, because at a certain point I'm going to need to use it. All right, that works fine. So sometimes when I cut this edge, it gets a little rough. I don't know if you noticed me kind of fussing with that. I'm just going to clean it up a little bit. So when it comes to constructing, something that's always useful, but definitely working on a larger scale, you want to be prepared that when you lift your slab up and you put it around whatever support, you have everything you need. So you're not thinking, gosh, I wish I was an octopus. I wish I had 3 more arms, so that you're ready when it's time to construct it. I'm just going to use this cardboard tube that I have. Sometimes you can get tubes like this from fabric stores. Sometimes the bolts of fabric come around it. If you don't have access to that, PVC works great, but you don't want your clay to stick to it. So you would want to have maybe cornstarch on the back of your clay, or something that I started using just recently that I've known about for a long, long time, but I didn't use until just this past year, was hosiery. So I had to like go to Walmart and find stockings, because who wears stockings anymore, but they still sell them. So if you had a plastic or something that is not porous as your support, you could even put newspaper around it. That works as well. So just something so that your clay would not stick. Turn this around, and I need to flip it over. Get my banding wheel over here, and a board. So it's not the size I'm going to make this, and I'm not trying to hug the tube. I'm just trying to have a little bit of support. So I'm easing this up because I'm not so sure how dry my clay is. It seems to be okay. Sometimes it'll stay put. If it doesn't, you just need a support behind it. It is still wet enough that I don't need to score. So I'm dampening it. Trying to not to get the tube damp, but I'm trying to get this edge damp so that it will connect. I need a different support because I need the tool. Then again, I have this cut on a bevel, So that inside of that flap is where I want it to sit up right on the edge of what's up here so that the flap goes over the top of this clay. That's my goal. And at first,
your tube doesn't have to be the size that
no, in fact, it's better that it's not tight. It just needs to be support. You don't want it flimsy, but no, it does not need to be the size. So at first I just kind of get it tacked, so I'm sure it's where I want it. Then I'm going to smear across the top, as well as across the bottom where the joint is. And then I'm going to use my pony roller to further tack it in place. And I am not going to run my roller all the way up or all the way down, because then you're going to stretch your clay out at either end. So I roll part way up and part way down. And I want to make sure my tube is underneath where I'm doing that. So at first I'm kind of gentle about it. I'm just kind of pressing it down in there a little bit. Again, I'm tacking. This is not the final secure. So by not having texture here, I'm not erasing or obliterating anything. I could have it here, but then I have these very distinct areas and I would lose that. So then I go about it with more pressure. And I am really not trying to hide that there's a seam there. I want a good attachment, but I'm fine with that seam showing. That sort of goes with a quote that I talked about earlier. I'm fine with people seeing how it was made, where it was joined. I just want it to be a good join. So this empty area, I'm going to go back in with that tool that I used earlier and make an additional line. So it is the seam, but it doesn't just look like it wasn't a part of the design. Then what I like to do is pick it up carefully and place it on my board. So going forward, I'm not going to handle the clay as much. And that's a key thing, how I work in general, but I think it becomes even more important working on a larger size. The more you handle it and wiggle things this way and that way, the clay gets confused and then maybe it warps or is difficult. So the least you have to handle it, the better. So my tube is helping me, and I lift it up. Now this is maybe how nature gave it to me, and there is a bit of a problem that I'm gonna fix. If I put this up on here though, is it gonna be okay? I have this up on here. I'll show you what that problem is in a moment, but first of all, this is not the shape I want. So a little bit of finessing. And if you have a smaller tube, if you want to, you can put a tube in this way and a tube in that way if you need to shape it that way, but I'm good to go here. But I have a cracking issue. I want you to see this. So right in here, it went a little deep and my clay was a little dry. I bent it right in that spot. That's something you have to be careful of. It's not deadly. I'm gonna have to work with it though.
Could you point the crack towards the camera?
See here? Right along where the pattern is. Is that visible? Okay. So I need to think about that. First of all, I want to move it so that my bend is not in that area. So that takes some of the pressure off. So now it's not so stressed. Then I'm going to go back in there with my foam brush and I'm going to dampen in there. And in one or two of these places, I'm going to use some sprigs in there to encourage it to stay together. It doesn't go all the way through, but if I didn't work with this, I would have a giant crack later. So in a way, with this damp sponge, what I'm doing is I'm compressing the clay, which is a great aid to the clay. So it's kind of messed this up. So that's something else I'll need to deal with. If it had gone much deeper, or if it had gone all the way to the top, it might have been time to start over. You know, when it comes to any problems with your projects, you have to make decisions along the way. And sometimes the decision is to scrap it. And sometimes the decision is to work with it. And this one I can work with. All right, that's much better. I don't want to add the bottom to this just yet. So I'm going to make a bunch of sprigs for this, and then we'll get to the bottom. Did you see when I lifted that off, I kind of had my hand on the top, but I was really moving the board. I don't want to move this around anyway, and especially with that issue that I'm dealing with here, I don't want to disturb it now that I compressed it. So it's like listening to what the clay is saying, and it's saying, handle me carefully, don't mess me up. So the way I work with sprigs is I like to have them pretty thin. I like to have them blend into my clay surface. So this clay is already thinner than what my vase is. And I'm gonna thin it down even more before I make my sprigs. So usually if I was at home in my studio working, I don't make things this sizable all that often, but nevertheless, you'd be making more than one at once. I'd prepare a bunch of sprigs ahead of time so I can pick and choose what ones I want to have when it's time to put them on my piece. And I'm going to do that now. I have the same variety. This is another surface I like to work on. If you haven't already heard me say this in previous workshops, this board's called an MDO board. It's a plywood with a paper covering, and you can probably tell that it'll absorb moisture also. Sheetrock does that. A lot of things do this. This doesn't dry out so fast. So this is what I have as my table work surface in my studio. All right, some sprigs. So I'm just going to stamp a bunch of things out here and then cut them out. This is another one of my favorite toys that I made. Some of you have probably heard this. I made this by, I'll demonstrate how I got this mold. Another spiral, another version of a spiral. As I told you, I like these. So this is some pretty soft clay, you can probably tell. So what I did was I made a carrot-shaped coil. And I rolled it on up into that spiral formation. I do handles like this. I'll show that a little bit later. So if I left this like this, when it went to dry, it would just open up. I need it to stay together, so I give it a little squeeze, and then I seal the ends. So I let this big fat coil dry. I bisque fired it. Then I took a big lump of clay, and I pressed, this was bisque, this was not, so the opposite of how it looks here, pressed it into the clay. This became the waste, more or less, though I kept that and used that. Then I let this dry, and I actually went back in and did a little carving as well. Bisque fired it, and this became the mold. It's great making some of your own molds and stamps because that personalizes your work. So this makes a nice big accent. It's a press mold. Sometimes I use the whole thing like that, but other times I just take part of it. And as long as your clay is not super soft, you know, gushy, fresh out of the bag, as I described it earlier, because these are bisque, they don't stick. All right, so I have a couple of those. I also love this leaf pattern. And I don't know what I'm going to use here. I'm giving myself a whole little bunch to play with, and then I'll sort of put it together like it's a collage later. Make a couple of those. Good thing I'm not firing my kiln tonight. It is super hot here. Yeah, I even heard on the radio earlier that if you have an electric car, they're asking you to please not try and power it up right now. They're trying to conserve, and right now it's voluntary, but if you use up too much power, it'll be mandatory. So I love this Dolan knife. This is one of my favorite tools, but for smaller, finer cuts, I like my slice knife. That's like an X-Acto, but a couple things I like about it: has a built-in cover. The blade is ceramic, and I've been using these for months and months now, and the blade doesn't come loose. That company is called Slice Products. If you go online and order for them, just put in the coupon code texture, and they'll give you 10% off. So I'm cutting this on a bevel because, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, I like my sprigs to blend in. If you want your sprigs to stand out, don't cut it on a bevel. This is just what I choose to do. Everybody has their own design aesthetic. So I'll do these two like this. And again, I like the clay to have a voice, so sometimes I just tear it. That torn edge, when you're working with oxides or underglazes, or even a glaze that moves over texture, can give you an interesting result. So sometimes I rip them. All right, let's cut these guys out.
Susan Frank says she had a new slicing and loves it.
Oh, cool. Yeah, they're great, great tools. A little more expensive than a regular X-Acto, but they don't rust and they really don't wear out. You can buy extra blades for this, but I haven't needed to at all, and I use it frequently. They also have ceramic scissors. I find it kind of amusing that the material is ceramic. I'm using it to cut ceramic. All right, let's cut this guy. And I'll cut out my leaves. I'll have my palette of choices here. So this is, let's see how thick this is, just for reference. Yeah, now these sprigs are about 1/8 of an inch thick. So they're about half the thickness that I would have of the main piece. Plus, when you cut them on a bevel like this, then they blend in even more into your surface of the piece. So I'm happy that in Sonoma County here and in California at large, but specifically Sonoma County, things are getting much better. Lots of people are vaccinated. Things are opening up, but I am missing the slower pace of last year. We're all readjusting to going back to what things are going to be. Didn't realize that we had slowed down that much. Okay, that's all good. Now I think I do need to add the bottom on this. And by the way, right at this point, guys, I could decide, oh, this was the top, but maybe this end, the other end would be a better top. You have that decision. And in this time, I actually have a little fan here, so that has aided it. It's stiffened up a fair amount. Let me check that problem area here. Okay. All right, I need to do something further with the phloem area, so I need to do one more thing, because it's still not happy part of this way. You're getting to see how I fix my mistakes or problems. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wet this down from here to here for sure. And I'm going to make myself a really, really thin coil. Skinny, skinny snake. So I'm working with my extra soft clay here to roll this out really thin. And I'm going to wet it one more time. And then I'm going to push this coil into that problem area. Because there's no point in going this far and then having the whole thing break later. How do I know to do this? Because I've been down this path before. Sometimes I take a tool in there, but I think I'm going to just leave that and I'll put some sprigs over it. But it totally messed up my chop. So I'm going to put a sprig with a chop right over the top of that other spot. Yeah, any of you that come to NCECA, please come say hello to me at my booth in the resource hall. I look forward to meeting some of you there or someplace else down the road. So that's going to go right over the top of that. And it's pretty wet right there from all the messing I was doing in that problem area. So I'm just going to put a little slip behind this. Oops. You would never know. Okay, now I need to add the base. Get out some more clay here. Now this clay has not been rolled out, so it's a little bit thicker than my main piece. So I just need to roll it out a little bit. And you're aiming to have this base or whatever clay you add on to be more or less the same dryness level so that they will relate and one part will dry faster than the other and either cause warping, cracking, different kinds of problems. And now if you noticed, I turned it the other way and rolled. That's one way that we compress our slabs, rolling in different directions. Compression also helps with warping and cracking. All right, let's get this guy on its base. But things have been sitting around for a while, so I think a little scoring would be a good idea. So what I'm gonna do is I make this ring of water, put this down for a minute or two, and then I wanna peel it off of there. And that's gonna mark where I need to score. My scoring tool is kind of a jerry-rig thing. It's a handle with a flexible metal rib bit shoved in there. It's actually 2 bits shoved in there so it doesn't loosen up. And I'm gonna flip this over, score down there. Checking my joint, looks good. And if you're going to do scoring, be serious about it. Don't do anything wimpy. If you don't put enough of a tooth in there, then there's really no point in doing the scoring at all. This was that problem area. Up further. Okay, now I'm gonna get my...
What did you just do to that problem area?
I just put a little bit of clay there, kind of as a Band-Aid. Because that will be hard to deal with later if I have any more problems down there. All right, get a bunch of slip on here. And I'm a believer when you're using slip to put more in than you need, because you want to fill all the gaps of the join. If you have air pockets, meaning you didn't put enough slip in there, then your join is weak. So I like it when the slip comes oozing out of the join. You can clean that up later. Again, see how I'm handling this? It's stiffer now, so it's a lot easier to handle. Plop it down on there, a little downward pressure, and rotate it back and forth, and then it kind of stays put. Checking around here. One little place I'm going to touch up. And then I don't cut the base off now. That joint is not that strong yet. You need it to really seal and be together. So I'm going to leave that. And I'll cut it a little later. Now, if you think there might be any gaps, a good thing to do is to rotate it and really kind of shove that base slab up so that you don't have any gaps between your cylinder or your vase and its base. Okay, this is the time to think about the top and to think about if you're going to do anything else and if there's going to be handles. I don't think I'm going to do too much more to this. I'm going to clean it up, and I might put a sprig or two on the inside, but I'll show you. This one, I took a different approach, and I might do this approach on the second one a little later. So this one I had a little softer finish, and then I had the handles. I haven't made handles yet, and I really think that the handles on this piece really changes the personality. For instance, look at this right now, covering these up. It changes the personality. To me, it makes it a little more playful and definitely elevates it a little bit, in my opinion. Now, my slab here is a little stiffer than this one that I worked on. I want to point this out, that in this area, in several areas, I kind of pooched it out, which again changes the personality a little bit. And a lot of people use tools when they're doing that kind of a technique. A lot of people will use, they're actually tools that they're sold for the doll maker industry to make eyes on the dolls. They have little balls on the end of these dowels. And I have some of those, but I prefer to use my fingers. So whenever I can, my preference is to use my hands, because then I can feel what's really happening. This is a tool I'm the most familiar with. I've had it my whole life. So I would go in and just kind of pooch it out in different areas. Because this is stiffer and because I have that issue with that crack, this one's not going to have that treatment. But I wanted to point out that that's another thing you can do.
Lynn, have you cleaned up the slip from the bottom inside of the base?
So it's funny that that question came up about how do I clean up at the bottom. I have a very long handled brush at home, which I did not bring with me. So I would go in with a brush, and Kayla's gonna see if we've got one over here in the studio. There's not too much down there, but you definitely want to clean that up. And before it dries out, perfect. Thank you, this will be perfect. So I just dampen my brush, reach down in there. And in my studio, right in front of my work table, I actually have a little tiny flashlight because sometimes you can't see all the way into the details, but you don't want to leave that unfinished looking because that just looks sloppy in the bottom.
You never had a coil?
I don't do a coil. A lot of people ask about that. If that's a practice that you're comfortable with and you feel it needs it or you just like what it does, go right ahead. It's not my practice. Also, another question that sometimes comes up about the seam is, do I make that seam totally smooth on the inside? And I don't worry about that. What I might do is the same thing that I did with the brush in the bottom, is just soften the join. As long as my join is strong, it doesn't bother me. In fact, I like that you can see what's going on there. All right, so I'm gonna just finish the top off with a barely damp sponge. Now this clay does have grog in it or sand, as I mentioned. So you don't want to go over it with a sponge like that too much because it's going to bring the sand to the surface. If you find that there is sand on the surface after you use your sponge, you can take a chamois, a piece of plastic, or even your finger and just kind of compress over the top to get that rough part pressed back in. I'm gonna wipe away this extra slip because I had plenty. And something I haven't done for very long, but was recently taught, when you go to cut the base, rather than cutting right away, first take your tool and make a little indentation as a guideline all the way around. And then when you actually go to cut, your tool is much less likely to jump off the spot where you want it to be. I'm still not always remembering this, but it is helpful. So now I've gone all the way around, cut a slit out here, and I'm trying to cut flush. That's my goal. Well, veered off a little bit. How about sunflowers and something this size? Dahlias look good. Calla lilies, I love calla lilies, yeah. So some of those long stem kind of flowers. Now I probably shouldn't have finished the top. I might have to go over it again because I want to turn this over to finish it. So depending on how I did, I might have to cut more away. This looks pretty good. I just take my finger and I'm just cleaning up that joint area. A barely damp sponge over it a little bit. You know, I'm trying to be direct and firm, but not too harsh because I don't want to get rid of the texture that I already put in there. Then I also take a thumb or a finger, you could do this with a tool, and I press over that edge because it's sharp and you don't want that sitting on your table, that sharp edge. I tap this in a little bit because if anything, when things dry, they sometimes bow out. So if you tap it in, then when it bows out, it's flat. All right, I'm gonna flip this guy back over. This looks pretty good. Now I'm gonna put a few sprigs on here. So if I turn it like this, is this visible?
are we trying to see?
I'm gonna start to put some sprigs. So this area, to me, looks like it needs something so that the design will be pulled together. And something on the bigger side, but that's too big, so I'm gonna cut that down a bit. I think that's what I'm going to choose, but it's still a little too large for what I need. And it's just this part of the process, which is why I like to have more choices rather than less, so when it comes time to put it together, I'm not scrambling. You know, I don't really like that. I think I'm going to end up using 2 leaves. So the leaves have gotten a bit drier now because they are so thin, but these are very easy to rehydrate. And I'll score a little bit. So what I think I'm going to do is put 2, one facing in each direction there. And just wet the clay here. And something like this, even if it wasn't this hot, you definitely want to dry something like this on the slower side. I have these sprigs I'm adding on. I may well add handles if there's time. I have that problem area. So I'm reaching in here to support from the other side as I place this down. So again, you'd want to dry it slowly so that everything could become more or less homogeneous in its dryness level. That,
If you could just show us after you.
yeah, that cuts down on problems. So something like that.
Those big sprigs.
I have used sprigs on my work for a number of years in this series that I refer to as the textured series that I just do a copper carbonate wash on. But over these 14 months, I got way more into sprigs and the oxide and underglaze washes. So I was able to do way more exploring than I would do in a more typical year, I would say. So I'm happy with this, but now I feel like it's drawing too much attention here. So I want to put a little something up here, not big, but a little something. Maybe I'll use one of these little leaves. You know, and if you don't know what your own design style is, or you're not sure how to approach this, I would encourage you, look through books, look through magazines, look on Pinterest, and even print out a bunch of pictures of things that you're drawn to. And it doesn't even have to be pottery. It could be wallpaper, it could be gift wrap, it could be furniture. But you would be surprised if you haven't done this before. If you start printing a few of things out and lay them out like your own little design board, you'd start to see what your style is. And I'm not saying that you have to get committed to one particular thing or another. Lord knows, as a Gemini, I sure don't. But you get a sense of what appeals to you and develop kind of a basis for your own style. All right, so I'm okay with that. But going around to here, this was that problem area. That would definitely be a good place for a leaf. And then it relates to the other side also. So I'm wetting this leaf. Luckily I had 3. If I needed to, I could make another one, but I have it. Some more slip on there. Are any questions coming up? No?
Here's a question. Do you use oxides or underglaze washes on greenware or after it's been bisque fired?
I do it on bisque. And I'm mostly these days using underglazes, but I do use the copper, as I said. And I recently, thanks to Susan Frank, got turned on to Georgie's interactive pigments. I have a lot more exploring to do with those. But I like to do that on bisque because your bisque is stronger, it's not fragile. And we can talk a bit more about that when I pull those finished ones out a little later. All right, so this leaf to me, pull these 2 parts together. But I think I want to do these 2 little guys, and then that might be enough. These 2 little leaves like these, somewhere on this part. You know, I want to say thank you, not only to those of you that are here today, but to everybody that attended any of the virtual workshops, and to Kayla and to Lexi in the Sonoma Community Center for having given me this opportunity over this long, crazy time that we all live through. As I've told my friends, before all this pandemic stuff came up, teaching online, it wasn't even on my list. I wasn't even thinking about that. But it has been an unusual and in some ways very wonderful opportunity that I'm grateful for. And it has pushed me to learn more things and be able to share more of my techniques. So I'm really grateful for all of that. So
it's been a wild ride.
It's been a wild ride. We took it together.
Here we are on the other side.
And so glad for that too. May continue to get better.
How do you attach the sprigs without pressing on the design?
Good question. So how do I get those sprigs on there without disturbing my design? Well, the sprigs are thin, so I don't have to press them that hard. And I have scored the back of them and experience. I'm not pressing so hard.
Do you ever add the sprig with the stamp? Sort of like as a, as a helper to get it on there and press it and stamp it?
You can add it that way as a helper, like I could take my stamp itself and do that. That's not something I've done, but that's certainly a viable technique.
If you use Georgie's pigments, do you use any clear glaze over it?
Yeah, that's what I'm working on, is learning which clear glazes work best. I bought a few of the pigments, and what I need to do are make some small little things to explore. Because like everything else, there's always more to learn. And it can be exciting and it can be frustrating, all of that. So I'm gonna call this one done so that we can move on to my showing how I make the one that's squared off. I'm just checking my sprigs to make sure that there aren't gaps, because the sprigs being so thin, if any parts are sticking way up, those little parts are going to dry faster, and then they're going to want to crack off when you handle them, or even after they're fired. So I don't like there to be any edges that are sticking up.
Doing a super close up.
So there's that one.
Could you show us the sprigs?
So I have, this became a sprig, my stamp, because I didn't like what happened when I was doing that repair. These are sprigs here. So by having these sprigs go over the area where there's no texture, to me, it joins the design together. And then the 2 bigger leaves and the smaller leaf here. So I have certain elements I've repeated. I don't want to use like 8 sprigs that don't relate to the rest of the design. This way? There we go. So really, even though this is a seam, it's not a front or a back. I still think of this as the back, but even in the pieces that I do, I taught the vase class called the stacked vases. Those are the ones that I do with the copper carbonate. And I think of that seam area, even though I do things on that back seam, as the back, but many a time someone will buy one and they'll send me a picture, and that's the part they displayed as the front, or at a gallery, same thing. So in a way, I like that because they're not thinking of it as not being a viable part of the design. All right, this guy's got to go live somewhere else now.
So Lynn, you're going to be teaching your first in-person class here coming up too.
Yeah, my first in-person class in a long while.
If anyone's local, check it out. It's on our website. We have 2 short, just one-day workshops, really.
That I'm going to teach in person. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that and seeing some of the Sonoma people again. So this is my other slab. That's how it came out of the slab roller. And I had it sitting off to the side because it was a little soft. Now it's feeling like it doesn't want to bend. So I'll show you my whole rehydrating process here. And especially since I'm going to try and do it squared, it needs to be able to bend. I'll do this and then I'll check the slabs I have in the bin in case there's a better one, but show you this process anyway. So I dampen one side and then I get out my trusty rib here and again do some compressing. Yeah, the 2 workshops, one is on windowsill vases. They are flat vases and we'll explore a couple of different shapes. And the other in-person workshop that we have lined up so far is working from a cylinder, all different kinds of things you can do. It could be a vase, it could be a cup, it could be a pitcher. So we'll start with cylinders and take them in a lot of directions. And I flip it over and I need to get the other side hydrated. And this will work if your slab is not too dry. At a certain point, it's time to put it back in the recycle bucket. So I'm going to leave that moisture on there for a moment. And this is a great way to make yourself some slip too. So this will go in my little slip container here. Then I'll show you here. So hoping to make one the same size. So it was, I divided it into quarters, but I don't want my seam to be right on the corner. If I put my seam directly on the corner of this piece, that is a weak spot. So I do not put the seam here. The seam is someplace in the middle, could be off to the side a bit, but definitely not in the middle. So one side, second side, third side, and the fourth side is divided. So I mark it on here and you'll see in a few minutes why that's useful. I'm going to double check and see if I have a better slab than this one. I think I have one that I can use that work out a little better. Just move this guy out of the way. But this rehydrating method is definitely something that I do from time to time.
Especially this time of year.
Yeah, sometimes it gets away from you. It's a little bit like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Too soft, too hard, just right. My fancy template here. That's what it's not. So if you are planning on coming to Ensika, you should definitely come to the town of Sonoma. There's so much going on. We've got a great town square, lots of wonderful restaurants.
You could fly into Santa Rosa.
Yeah.
Which is only 45 minutes north of Sonoma, and then come down to Sonoma, wine and dine yourself, stop at the studio, we'll have a show here, there'll be a lot of ceramic shows in Sonoma at that time. And then you could head out to Sacramento from Sonoma, or reverse the trip, and...
So you don't want to come to California for 3 days. No, no, no. Even if you come for a week, you're just dipping your toes in the water, but you'll get a little more sense of it. And if, you know, if you've been in these classes, it would be great if you could come see the community center where there will be stuff going on for sure.
And then San Francisco is only 40 minutes from Sonoma. Golden Gate Bridge is 40 minutes. So, yeah.
Great way back to get back into the world. Come to California and Ensika. I didn't show this tool today. I know I've shown it before. I got turned on to this a few months ago. It's a spray bottle, but it's not like the spray bottles like you buy at the drugstore or whatever. This is meant to be used on hair, but it has a very fine mist. So I was turned on to it when I was about to give a surface workshop because of that fine mist. It's a continuous fine mist. It's called a Flaresol, and of course I bought it online. So the clay that I'm using today is that bee mix that I mentioned to you, but it's bee mix I recently put through my pug mill, so I apologize for all these air bubbles. It was fresh out of the bag, they wouldn't be there. All right, a little bit of moisture on the other side, just about there. I think next week I'm going to get my second haircut. I cut my bangs a lot during this last 14 months. I tried cutting my hair once and then vowed I'd never do that again because I'm not a hairdresser. And then I got one haircut. It's been crazy.
Did you pop all those little bubbles, or?
I popped a lot of them, but there's still some there.
Yeah.
And there's not hair bubbles aren't so much a problem with hand building as they might be for throwing. And in the firing, it's this misunderstanding that the air is why your pieces crack or blow up. No, it's the steam that forms in the bubble. That's the problem. Let's see what we got here. All right, we're gonna pretend this works. So what do I want to do? Something different.
I think that angle pattern is cool on the dark face.
Yeah, the angle here, yeah. So I might do an angle with this one. I think I'm going to use this pattern, which is my doodle pattern. The question is, do I want to use a second pattern? Yeah.
More is more.
Yeah, more is more. But what pattern do I want?
How tall is the vase you're making now?
So I'm still using that same fancy template that's 14 by 16 inches. And obviously smaller when it shrinks and is fired.
And was that the same size as the first one?
Yes, that's the size I used on the first one. Okay, I think I'm just gonna go playful. So there's still both broad patterns, but different styles. So there's still a little bit of contrast. And Kayla mentioned this angle that I have in here, so I think I'm gonna put that into effect this time too, but let's get this on here. So again, I mark this one edge. It's probably gonna end up being a little bit smaller just because of the slab versus the size of the file folder, but it'll be in that same size range. And I'll show you something that I do with this doodle pattern. With the larger patterns, it's nice to go back in and use other stamps. And so I do that, but I also like to talk to people about doing that because you don't want to leave it just as is and people go, oh, you bought that from Lynn Woods. You want to make it your own. And there's a lot of ways to do that. And this is going to be one way that you do that. Now I got the surface of the clay a little wet. No, that worked out okay. Maybe I'll change the angle up a little bit. I like to say that when we're working with clay, sometimes we need to remember to be 2 years old again and play, and not always think that every piece is precious, that it's always about the result. Because we work with such a physical material, I think sometimes we lose sight of that. And if we can let go a little bit, sometimes a particular piece might not come out, but it's a step in your journey that could be a good step for whatever reason. Not just because it came out of the kiln great, is what I'm saying. All right, I'm gonna go wonky with all these angles on this one. And this circle mat came out of another mat that I had. Most of the mats I brought today, because we're working so large, were these bigger ones, but some of them are divided into sections. And I had one in particular that's called the foursome mat. And I have 1/4 of it was these circles, and people were asking for a bigger mat. So I did a bigger one with circles, because a lot of people were asking for that. And there's something about dots. I swear to God, I tried to look up the psychology of this. I never did figure it out, but I'm telling you, when people see my pieces with circles and dots on them, it makes people smile. There's something happy about dots. Oops. So I don't know how I'll finish this one, but I already know I'm not going to finish it in black. It's way too cheery. This one needs to be a different color. All right. So that's my main design. And as I said before, that's what I put down before I do the final cutting. Now the final cutting will happen, and then I'll go back in.
Could we see that final design again?
Yeah, I bet. Then I'll go back in and put some details as I did with the previous one.
One side beveled, one side not beveled, right?
Right, and I bevel the left edge because I'm left-handed. And the right edge, I cut straight so that I have enough bulk when I join my seam. And there are people that bevel both ends and that works for them. They're probably just not as heavy-handed as I am. For me, I found that my seam area got too thin when I beveled both ends. So I stopped doing that a number of years ago. All right, cut my bottom here and then see what I've got. So I'll use my other seam marker here. And you know that I showed you this tool earlier. You can do something like that along an edge or make finer ones if you don't have or don't want this kind of a tool. This just happens to be one of my personal favorites. And sometimes the lines aren't always straight, and since this one is definitely on the playful side, that seemed appropriate. The other thing about working in a series that I always like to encourage people about is things happen. Not only do your skills develop, but ideas happen organically. You can't plan for everything, but you know, when I'm making a series of cups or smaller vases or something like that, and I get to about the fourth or fifth one, something happens and you get in a groove. So if you find a particular piece, whether it's a bowl, plates, teapots, whatever it is, a thing that you're really into, it's good to work in a series. I think you get more out of it that way. All right, where's my little tool here? This is that one that I made from the foam. So some circles in here would be good. Some dots so that it relates to the other pattern. And then I like to use this. Some of this way that I have been using the underglazes, like on both those vases that I did in my kiln, originated, I don't know how many years now, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. I started making bird ornaments with texture and underglazes. And then it kind of crept into the bigger pieces over the past year or so. If you go onto my Instagram and scroll through some of the old ones, you'll see those birds. I still make those. Oh, let's put my chop in that spot. Needed something. There we go. All right. Okay, so now here's the thing. I go back in here, and where I have these parts delineated that equal a side, I go back in with a tool, and I just mark on my slab. That's telling me where each corner should be after I get this put together, so I know how to kind of form it into that squared off top. Right. Now you behave, I don't want problem areas like the other one. There we go. Yeah, this clay is softer, which is particularly good since I want to square this off. Because unlike the other one, there are going to be kind of 4 corners. And if I had problem areas in the corners, that'd be a lot harder to deal with. There we go. Dampen this up. So I have my flap, and the inside of my flap needs to sit on this edge. Ease it into place. Hopefully getting it lined up. So I'm tacking it. And remember, I'm not going to go off any ends. I'm going to tack halfway up. My tube is not quite as long as my slab. Tack in that direction. And each time I put a little more pressure and I lean in a little bit more to the edge of the seam. tube to move down. There we go. I don't want to press so hard when there's nothing supporting it underneath. Right, that's good. Now the other end, I want to make sure it gets secure. There we go. Okay, time to dress this up a little bit. Stamps. I forgot which end I called the top. It doesn't matter, I can change my mind. So lifting it into place. Okay, I did do it properly, meaning this was going to be the top because that's where my marks are for changing the shape. So get it back up here on the banding wheel. I don't even need the board right now. So I have my 4 marks, and then it's kind of gently easing it into shape a little bit at a time. It's still a soft slab. I'm not going to have hard edges, but it's going to read squared. So I have my arm going down in here to support what I'm doing on the outside. So it was much more beneficial to have this slab softer. If I had used the slab that I used for the first one for this, every place where I made that turn would have had some difficulty. So it's that balancing act of getting your clay to be the dryness level that works for what you're trying to do to it. But because of that softness, right now, I'm going to need to let that set up a little bit before I do any more to it. So I think I'll take this time. If you have questions, I can answer them, but I also could talk about my process of finishing the surfaces on these in my electric kiln. I use a lot of Amico velvet underglazes. There are other brands that are great. If you are not somebody that is well-versed in using underglazes, I definitely would say test. Could I sit now? Would you be able to focus on me if I sat down for a few minutes? That would help me out. There's a lot of standing. Pardon you guys while I get my chair. So, Duncan makes a product they call concepts. They call them underglazes. They are not. They get a shine. They have silica, which is glass in them. And if you use them, like on the bottom of your piece, like I do on these pieces, they're going to stick to the kiln shelf. So always test when you're working with new products of any kind. Like I said, I really like the Amico underglazes. This black happens to be a Laguna product, and it's just something I've used for a million years, but the Amico blacks are also good. And then I have a few underglazes that I use that are Leslie's product. Now, Leslie's as a company doesn't exist anymore, but they sold all the rights, if you will, of distribution of their glazes, underglazes, clays, and they also make a lot of display products. That's all handled now by a place in Santa Clara, California called Clay Planet. So if you want to use any of the Leslie's ones, go there. Okay, so when I make these, I bisque them, I dry them and bisque them as you would normally. Then I apply the underglaze all over the piece as a wash. So I thin it down from the container and brush it on let it dry, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes at least, and then you're gonna wipe back so that you're highlighting certain areas. It's thicker in the indentations, which is a lot more obvious on the black, but trust me, it is on the green as well. And then that container that I used, that I kept cleaning out my sponge over and over to get more what I was after, I let that sit around for a day or so, pour the water off, and pour the underglaze black in the container. So there's not a lot of waste. You're not using a lot. Then I put my pieces through the bisque again. And I very specifically do that so that when I put these highlights of glazes on here, especially in like in this little spot on this green one here, any goes over the edge, any little part that's not where I need it, I can wipe it off and it does not wipe off the underglaze that's in the background. Now on this particular piece, all these square and rectangles, I also used a masking tape to block off the area. But say here, these little stripes and this little stripe here, I want to have a really clean edge. And even if you're really careful, it goes over a little bit or your hand moves or something. And if you wipe it off and it wipes off your underglaze, well, then where are you at? Nowhere good. So the other thing that happens is I have the inside glaze, which was a question that came up from somebody on one of my social media. Well, will they hold water? Yeah, the inside is completely glazed. It's just not at this top area. So I have to wax all of this area so that when I have my glaze and I'm pouring it out, it doesn't disturb any of this. The other reason that I like to bisque a second time comes up, especially when I use the black. And that is when I take it out of the second bisque and it doesn't have this maroon color on here or the green that might be a little hard to see through the camera. It just has the black underglaze. I take sandpaper to the piece and I sand away some of the black to highlight some of the upper areas. So I get a clean sand. I'm not blurring anything because the color is on there, but I can sand away what I don't want to be there. And same thing, the inside is completely glazed, and when I apply that glaze, I have to wax around here. So I finish all my accent colors out here, then I apply I apply wax to this upper area and around this rim, so that when I pour out my whatever color glaze I put on the inside, it doesn't get on any of these areas out here. Are there any questions about that process or anything about the color or whatnot?
There's a question about the dimensions, 14 inches tall or wide?
I did it 14 inches wide and no. Let me just get the tape measure out because I can't even memorize my own dimensions here.
It looks like 14 inches, almost like square actually.
Yeah, it's 14 by 16, so it's not much different.
You can change it around too.
Right, it could go either way. So I made the height 14 and the width 16. But it, you know, you can add an inch and a half, see what works for you proportionally, and keep good notes, especially when you're trying something new. Okay, so this one, back to this now. It's squared off here. The bottom, I'm not so sure it's as square as I want it to be, so it's set up a little bit, so I'm going to flip it over. And I could have put those tick marks on the bottom. That would probably be a good idea, but I'm going to have to eyeball it here. And as I have said in many other workshops, any kind of a template that you're working with, anything that comes up, good, bad, or indifferent, that you want to remember, that you think you may not remember, write it right on your template, and then you have that at the ready. The next time you pull that template out, you don't have to find your notebook.
Lynn, do you wear a mask when you sand?
Yes. And the other good thing to do when you're sanding, wearing a mask is good practice, but but it's also good, number one, do it outside, but if you can't and you're gonna do it inside, have a container of water underneath where you're sanding. So you have a mask on, and then a lot of the dust is going into that container of water.
When you sand back, do you use a glaze to go over the same area to add color?
Sometimes, it just depends on what I'm after, not necessarily. Sometimes I add more color, but sometimes I want that contrast of the black and white. So I'm gonna add a base here. And this slab, again, hasn't been rolled out. So I'm gonna roll it out a little bit. Pardon the squeaks. This is soft, this is soft. I don't think I need to score on this one, but I do want to wet it in place. Put it down, a little downward pressure, and then I wiggle it a little bit. This is a technique I was taught many years ago by Virginia Cartwright. When you're not needing to score, but you really want it to form a suction. Then I'm going to cut some of the excess off. I'm going to leave some of it because remember that joint is not firm yet. It's just starting to set up. You know, they just met. Not even good friends yet. So the bond is not that strong. Then I'm going to tilt it in all four directions just to kind of shove that base slab up. Okay, so I want to do the top edge on this one like I did on the finished one so you can see that process. And I need some clay to make the strip from. Let's move the vase out of the way for the moment. I want kind of a fine texture there. So I'm going for the torn edge, and to go for the torn edge, I'm going to bevel both sides of my strip. So as I work with this strip, I'm going to actually cut the strip into parts. As I work with these, that thin edge is going to start to tear. It happened a million years ago to me by accident. And I thought, wait, I like that. How can I make that happen on purpose? So I'm going to roll it out a little bit, and I hold one end up so that it doesn't buckle. Then I flip it over, because if I don't flip it over, it starts to go off in a wonky direction. One more time here. I usually end up pulling the ends off. Okay, now I'm going to put the texture on there. It's tearing, that's okay, I pieced these anyway. That might be enough, but let's do this one last piece here, so I'm sure I have enough. So first I have to thin it down. This clay's a little drier than I'd like. I'll make it work, but that's what we do, we make it work. Okay, get some texture going on here. One last little bit, and I'm leaving some of it blank, which is, you know, one of those things I do, not only on the piece, but sometimes on the accents too. All right, there we go. Now, I don't attach it directly on here because that's harsh. So I make a little coil that's the cushion so that when I put that strip around there, it's a softer look and it doesn't crack. So I have some of my soft clay here to make into a coil. I always stand when I make coils, and you want to use consistent moisture content clay, and you want to make a million of them so you get good at it. You want to keep your hands parallel to the table, and I learned not to use my fingers because when you use your fingers it tends to go down.
Do you ever wet the table when you roll into this?
I do sometimes wet the table. If your coil is on the drier side, or if you're in a weather condition like we are right now, sometimes that's helpful. You can just wet the coil wet the table right in front of you working in, just barely, and then roll over it. That's a great tip that I just started using a couple of years ago when I need it. All those little nuances of things that we do. So I want to put this back up on the banding wheel here. If you don't have a good banding wheel, get one. It's a fabulous tool. Ask for it for your birthday. I was lucky. I had an inexpensive banding wheel. This one belongs to the community center, but I have one similar to this at home. I had an inexpensive and okay banding wheel for a number of years, and then somebody gifted me a Shimpo banding wheel. They are so good you could practically throw a pot on them. They have great action. So I'm moistening here for my coil, and then I'm going to moisten on the inside of my piece and then around on the outside. So those places where the strip's going to go. And when I put my coil on top of here, I am not going to start at a corner for all the reasons that we didn't do anything right directly in the corner. And I'm giving it a little pressure down and a little pressure forward as I go here. This turned out to be longer than I needed. Sometimes I have to put more than one. Either way, it's fine. Hoping to have it more or less even. Emphasis on more or less. And I'm going to wet the end of that.
Are you adding coil to the top?
So the coil goes on the top so that when I fold my strip over it, it's not a harsh, hard bend. I want something more organic, and I don't want my strip to crack over that edge. And we'll look at those two other pieces because even though there was a coil on the top of both of those, it's a very different finish. So we'll look and compare those in a couple of minutes. So then I'm going to dampen up here, make sure I got enough moisture here. So my strip edges are pretty thin like my sprigs are. So I need to be careful that these edges get placed down. And then sometimes, like in this hot weather, I get a little concerned that right in here, when I go to bend it, it's going to crack. So I just introduce a little water there.
How wide are the textured strips?
These happen to be probably about, oh, good guess. I was going to say 2 inches. They could be wider, they could be narrower. That's up to the artist. So then I place it, and I don't like any of my strips to end on the corner. That's a theme, you're hearing me say that. And then I'm bending it like it's fabric. I'm not trying to be really too directive with it. If it folds, I'm okay with that. So I just get it kind of tacked. Then I'm going to pick another one. I like this one. You know, sometimes these finishing pieces, like the little handles, those little finishing touches, change the personality of a piece. So here's the second one, and this is going to need one more. These aren't done yet, they're just kind of in place. So I need one more. I once gave a mini workshop that we called Details Matter. Kind of examine, you know, again, that working in a series. What if you didn't put a handle? What if you put this kind of handle? What if you put the handles in this place? And so the edges of pieces are very important because that's one of the things that your eyes are drawn to. So what does or doesn't happen there makes a big difference. So now, all these parts where the strip is making contact, I need to really press those in. Those are places that it's going to dry faster and is going to crack if it's not attached to the piece. So both.
Find that this added strip decreases warping or cracking on the rim?
Oh, it may well do that, but I'm not certain. That's a very good question. It probably would help with warping because you're adding a lot more structure here. I never questioned it that way, but that's a very good point. And if your slab of your vase was different thicknesses just through your working it, it could have some warping issues. Drying them slowly helps with that, but it doesn't totally prevent it. So I may have solved a problem that I didn't even know could have come up. Good question.
It would also protect the rim from drying out too fast, or those.
Yeah, there's more bulk here. There's more stuff happening here. And of course, your top is going to dry faster than the rest of the piece. Yeah, pay attention to your drying situation. Sometimes on some of these various, I'm cutting the base, by the way, now, guys. I'm just going to do my indentation. But sometimes on these various pottery groups that I'm part of on Facebook, people will ask questions about cracking, and I look and I say, okay, 25 people already commented. I don't need to comment, but sometimes the questions are complicated, but sometimes they're just about people that haven't experienced it much. Oh, I want to say a handful of years, I had a clay that I was using and had used for about 4 or 5 years. And I started having cracking on little tiny dessert plates. And if I had been a beginner, I would have been really despondent and I would have thought it was really my fault. I don't know if the formulas, the clay changed or whatever, but after a while, stupid little cracks that didn't make any sense to me at all, I decided it was time to use a different clay. All right, I don't want to put this down on the rim, and this is firm enough now that I can work with the base. Just a little moisture. Press it in a little bit. And I'm going to ask you guys a question. I would really love for some of you to speak up when I ask this question. And if you do, I always like to hear your name and where you're from. In this virtual world, it's a little way that we can connect. So I'm going to turn this, and I want you all to take a look at it. And I want you to think of what else you might do to this if it were your piece. And if anybody wants to speak up, Kayla will hopefully say your name, and then you can unmute yourself.
Could you give us another revolution of the piece?
Yes,
so we can take a look?
yes. Because I definitely think.
Just speak up.
Yes,
now, or
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah,
this is
who's that?
Susan Frank from Boise, Idaho.
Hi, Susan, good to have you. So what would you do?
I'm crazy about feet, so I would put some feet on it.
Wow,
I
that
know
would
it's
change
tall. I know it's tall.
it. The thing that feet does, I mean, yes, it physically elevates it, of course, but the thing about that too is sometimes by letting some air underneath your piece, it takes away kind of a heavy feeling. So that's an
Yeah.
interesting suggestion.
Now, that one would probably need 4 feet because of the
Yes.
square.
And I'd have to wait because it's not firm enough, so it would have to be leather hard, but that's a thought. Anything else you do?
Handles.
Yeah, I know.
All right, I'm going away.
Okay, thanks for your input. I like
Welcome.
that.
Welcome.
Anybody else?
Hi, this is Mary from San Luis Obispo, California, Central
Hi,
Coast.
Mary.
Hi. Well, I was thinking about the handles, but I thought kind of longer handles rather than those little curly ones on the other vase that you had, but maybe a bit longer and offset so they don't match. Well,
Oh, yeah, that offset can be an interesting thing to play with. It definitely
Yeah.
changes the personality.
but I wouldn't bring them out that far, maybe just like an inch away from the base, just for some, yes, exactly, that's it. That's what I was thinking.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. You know, just having this little conversation with the two of you so far, I think it's a good exercise to do in a group setting where people all have their input and everybody could start with a cylinder and then we could kind of pass them around the table and everybody's going to add to everybody else's piece. You know, other people, that's the great thing about being with other creative people. Everybody has their viewpoint. Anybody else want to say what kind of handle or anything? Would you put more texture, whatever? What would you
Lynn.
do?
This is Peggy.
Hi, Peggy.
Hi. I was thinking it might be kind of fun to think about handles and playing off some of the texture that you have. Is there something that you could highlight in your texture in the handle shape?
Interesting. And you know, if I did that, Peggy, I think what I would do is take this texture from this rim. Because the one thing that I'm not so fond of is that I like that texture being there, but it's not anywhere else on the piece. So it would be a way to tie that texture into the rest of the piece.
Yeah, I like that.
Cool.
There was a question about, do you cover the top of the vase in plastic to help slow down the drying?
So my drying situation, drying is always a thing, and everybody has their own methods, and it depends on your work area and your climate. But I have 2 small, basically non-working refrigerators. One is an old wine fridge, and the other is actually an old cooler, but it has the gasket in it, just like a fridge would. So those are great drying boxes. But sometimes I don't have enough room in them, and they have to things have to dry out under plastic. So I don't usually put something right over the rim unless I have a very thin rim, which I typically don't have. But what I do is I wrap everything in plastic, but I put ripped up pieces of newspaper in there, because if you just have plastic, it's going to be like a greenhouse effect, and it's going to sweat and dry and sweat and dry. And so the newspaper will wick away some of that excess moisture. That's my method, and it works for where I live in my situation. Any other input, questions, comments about either of these?
This is Sue from Minnesota and Arizona, and it needs your sprigs. It just needs something dimensional. So it's not quite playful enough.
Yeah, I agree.
No, I agree too. I just wanted, I made the very conscious decision to stop here to get input from you all, and this one I was claiming was playful. I think maybe some sprigs of the circles could be here, could go over the top. There could even be circle sprigs added to the handles.
Lynn, is this one soft enough to pooch it out like you were talking about?
I could probably do some pooching.
pooching.
Let's see. All right, let's see if I can do that a little bit. So I've done this on cups initially, but I've done it on all forms. And what I found when I've taught it is people get a little nervous. So what I say is do it a little bit at first, and you can always go back and do more. So I'm kind of holding back here to give it a little bit of a boundary. I can't pooch this out as much as I might with some others because it's soft, but kind of not that soft, you might say. And I've done this on cups where I got a little overly ambitious and pooched it out so much that I had a hole. You know, how far is too far? Sometimes you don't know till you go there. Especially if I do it in these little circular areas. And the other thing I like about doing this kind of a pooch thing is that with slabs, we don't naturally think of something having volume the way things do when people throw on the wheel. But this effect, yeah, some of these parts are a little too dry. This effect does create a little sense of volume. And whoever the last person was that spoke, I totally agree. It needs more to happen to make it more playful, especially since I have these kind of playful patterns on here. But I like that idea of maybe some handles where I could include this other texture. So I could include this texture from the top, but put sprigs of the circles. And I could definitely have more sprigs on here in other places.
Lynn, this is Sue again. Have you ever carved out small holes or whatever to add, on the top of your vase? Because, if there's water in there, it's only going to be half full.
Oh, poke all the way through? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I've been thinking about that for a while. I don't know that I do that on this particular piece. I haven't done it, but I have some ideas related to that. And that's definitely could give it a playful feeling, if that's the feeling you're going for. And I like the idea of that, of having maybe just a couple of holes in a vase, and you can place your flower so that it comes outside the hole. I mean, it's really creates a whole nother dimension in terms of how you put the flowers in the piece. Did anybody work on any while I was here working, you guys? So I totally love to see what people have done. That's how I got into those interactive pigments, because Sue sent me some images, and I love the finishes on her piece, and she got me turned on to those Georgie's pigments. So
How are the pigments different than a mason stain?
they're a combination of probably oxides and things, and they're specific colors, and I'm not sure exactly what they do. I'm putting a little sprig here while we're talking, but they have a very different effect. And I was hesitant at first to buy them. I had heard of them years ago, but when I saw what Sue had done, and then also when I went back onto the Georgie's website and looked at how the different glazes and the different pigments at different thicknesses looked, I realized there was just something more going on there. So they have figured something out that I think is pretty cool, actually. I still have a lot more to learn, but you might want to check those out. Any questions at this point, you guys? More comments? Well, we might be done. That might be the end of this virtual workshop and this 14-month journey that we have taken together virtually. I know some of you have been in my other classes, and again, I hope to meet anybody that comes to NCECA next year. I certainly hope to meet you. And always feel free to email me a question about this workshop or a comment about the workshop, or email me the picture. I love to see what people have done because everybody puts their own spin on it. That's the great thing about this material. The possibilities are endless.
Lynn, this is Peggy. I've got a quick question. What's the tallest vase that you've done with this technique?
This height's the tallest I've done, but I'm thinking I could, with the right conditions, go 2 to 3 inches higher.
Mhm.
My clay would have to be the right dryness level and whatnot, but I could see going a few more. And the other thing is you can build like this, you can add another section on here.
Right.
So that's another way to go taller. If you let this set up and made it leather hard, you made a 7 piece, just like people join throne pieces together, you can join slabs together too. You know, what
Okay.
I've done is not the be all end all, it's a technique, and then you take it where you take it,
Mhm. Good.
right?
Yep.
Well, thank you, Lynn, for making our time at home away from our studio so much fun and learning and full of learning. So
And
Yes,
thank you
thank
for
you.
joining me in
It
this
was
journey. I
wonderful.
appreciate that so much.
We're gonna
This was
miss
fabulous.
having you.
Lynn, this is Martha.
Hi, Martha.
Hi, how you doing? I just want to thank you for everything. And I just have so much fun with texture, and you've been great.
Thank you, Martha. I hope to see you again sometime down the road.
Thank you. You're not planning to come east again, are you?
Not at this moment, but you never know.
Okay, you take care.
Thank you, and thanks for joining me here.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Lynn. I'll see you at NCCA.
Thanks, Lynn.
Wonderful. Can't wait. Bye, everybody.
Bye.